The siren screamed, cutting through the quiet night like a razor. The headlights of the ambulance blazed through the rain, casting long, warped shadows on the slick, empty road. It was a night like any other, dark, wet, and cold. The radio crackled with a new call coming through. Respiratory arrest, elderly male, 15 minutes out. Nina gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white, and took a deep breath. Another call, another life on the line. Another minute in the back of this cramped, vibrating box, a metal cage of sweat, rubber, and fear. She glanced over at Ben, her partner, as he prepped the equipment in the back. He was quiet, focused, used to this. They had been partners for years. He didn't need to speak. His eyes said everything, the pressure, the weight, the urgency. Nina's mind raced, calculating the seconds. 15 minutes out. They had to be faster. The elderly man's lungs were failing. Every second counted. Her pulse thumped in her ears. The world outside the ambulance blurred. The tires sloshed through the rain, sending up spray that seemed to cling to the windows, adding to the suffocating pressure inside the vehicle. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of sweat and gasoline. Ben's voice broke through the tension. "Got the mask ready. If he's still breathing when we get there, we'll need to intubate fast." Nina nodded. The intensity in his voice was a reflection of the life and death game they were about to play. She glanced at the dashboard. 5 minutes to go. She thought of the man, lying somewhere in a house or on a porch, struggling for breath. His family, waiting in silent panic, praying for a miracle. But Nina didn't pray. Not anymore. Too many calls. Too many people who didn't make it. The ambulance jolted as they hit a pothole, snapping her out of her thoughts. She reached for the mic, her voice calm despite the storm in her chest. "Dispatch, this is Unit 24. We're 5 out. We'll need a stretcher and oxygen when we arrive." There was a brief pause, then the dispatcher's voice, flat and unemotional, came through. "Copy that. Stretcher and oxygen on standby." As the road stretched out before them, Nina's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement, red and blue mixing like a living thing, a reminder of the constant push and pull of life and death she faced daily. The ambulance bumped over another rough patch of road, and the tires screeched, slightly as they made the sharp turn onto the narrow dirt road leading to the house. Nina swung the doors open, the cold air rushing in. The sound of labored breathing hit her ears before she even saw the man. His daughter stood by the door, eyes wide with panic, hands shaking. They said he stopped breathing," she stammered, stepping aside to let Nina and Ben inside. Nina didn't need to ask questions. She moved like a machine, her hands grabbing for the oxygen tank as Ben lifted the old man's limp body onto the stretcher. The man's skin was pale, his breathing erratic, shallow. His chest barely rose with each breath. Nina could feel the weight of his life in her hands. Ben was already on the phone with dispatch, calling for backup. They needed to move fast. Every breath the man took or didn't was a countdown. The woman stepped back, her face contorting with fear. "Please save him." Nina didn't look at her. She was focused, pulling on gloves, slipping the oxygen mask over the man's face. The sound of his shallow breaths filled the air. They needed more. He was fading. "I'm going to need you to step back," Nina said, her voice firm but steady, trying to shield her own emotions. She didn't have time to think about the family. There was no space for that, just the man. Ben started the IV and Nina worked the breathing mask, forcing air into the man's lungs. It wasn't enough. His chest barely moved. Nina's mind raced. The seconds felt like hours. Come on," she muttered under her breath. Ben's face was grim. "He's not responding." The tension was suffocating. Nina had been here before, but each time felt like the first. The helplessness, the inevitability, the reality that you couldn't save them all. But she had to try. "Don't you dare leave," she whispered, more to herself than to the old man. Her eyes flicked to his face, the darkened eyes barely open, his lips pale and cracked. He wasn't just fading. He was slipping away, and no matter how hard she worked, it felt like she couldn't reach him. She kept at it, the rhythm of her hands moving with muscle memory, and then, in the stillness of that cramped, humid space, something shifted. A faint whisper, a rasping sound. Nina's heart jumped. She leaned in closer. "Did you hear that?" Ben paused, his face hard, eyes narrowing as if waiting for confirmation. The man's eyes fluttered open. For a second, everything stopped. His voice came weak, hoarse. "I saw you before we met." Nina froze. She couldn't process the words. The reality of the moment slammed into her chest, pushing the air out of her lungs. What was he talking about? Had he seen her before this? She shook her head slightly, a shiver running down her spine, her hands still holding the oxygen mask to his face. "Who?" she started to ask, but her voice caught. She couldn't finish the sentence. She had no idea what he meant, no idea what was happening. But there was something in his eyes now, something that was beyond the pain, beyond the oxygen and the machines. And for the briefest moment, Nina wondered if she'd just heard the first real prayer of her life. The seconds ticked by slowly, each one like an eternity. The old man's breathing had steadied slightly, the rhythm uneven but there. It was as though he had come back from the edge and was teetering between two worlds. Nina kept the mask over his face, her fingers trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something she couldn't quite name. Ben worked silently beside her, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the man's faintly moving chest, making sure the IV was secure. His hands were quick, efficient, but even he couldn't hide the tension that had settled in the small space of the ambulance. Nina couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. "I saw you before we met." She shook the thought out of her head, forcing herself back into the task at hand. There was no room for distractions. She needed to focus. But the old man's eyes, those eyes kept drawing her in. They were cloudy, but there was a depth there, something raw and real. Something familiar. "Sir," she asked gently, her voice strained but controlled, "can you tell me what you meant? What do you mean you saw me before we met?" He blinked slowly, his mouth moving as though words were struggling to break free from the fog. Nina leaned in closer, afraid that if she stepped away for even a second, he would slip away again. His labored breathing filled the tight space, but it wasn't the rattling sound of someone on the brink of death anymore. There was life there. There was hope. "I saw you," he repeated, his voice weak but insistent. "I saw you in the light, in the dark. I saw you when I couldn't breathe, when I thought it was over." Nina's heart beat faster. She wasn't sure whether it was the adrenaline or something else, but the room felt warmer now, the air thicker. She didn't understand what was happening, but she couldn't look away. I don't understand," she said quietly. "Where did you see me? How?" His eyes locked onto hers then, and for the first time she saw something more than pain. It was something almost peaceful, a deep, aching kind of peace. "I saw you before this, before tonight," he said slowly, each word like an echo of something long buried. "I saw you when I was lost, when I didn't know where I was going. And there, in the dark, you were there. You walked beside me." Nina's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond. Her mind raced, searching for the words to make sense of what he was saying, but nothing felt real. She was just the nurse. She was the one who held the mask and the needle, who made the calls. She wasn't supposed to be part of the story, but here she was, standing in the middle of it. Ben glanced up, sensing the shift in the air, but Nina was frozen. The old man's words were like a pull on her soul, an invisible thread tying her to something bigger than herself. "Sir," Nina began again, her voice a whisper, "I'm not sure what you mean. I'm just trying to help you breathe. I'm here for you." The old man nodded, his breathing still shallow, but steadier now. "You're here. That's what matters." Nina couldn't bring herself to ask him if he was sure of what he was saying, but part of her already knew. She knew that he wasn't speaking in any metaphorical sense. He was speaking about something real, something that had touched him, something that had followed. Him here. And suddenly Nina felt it too, a presence unseen but undeniable hovering just behind her. It was so subtle, so quiet, but it was there. The air seemed to shift just slightly. The weight of the ambulance, the weight of her own thoughts, suddenly felt lighter. "Thank you," the old man whispered, his eyes closing again. "I'm not afraid anymore." And that was when Nina understood. It wasn't just the old man who had been lost, who had been found. It wasn't just the patient who had seen something real. She had too. She wasn't alone. As she looked at him, the words that had been so deeply buried in her heart began to rise to the surface. But she didn't say them. She couldn't say them. Not now. Not yet. All she could do was keep him breathing, keep him alive. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was just doing a job. She wasn't just pushing through the motions. She was a part of something real. Ben's voice broke through the silence. "We're almost there, we're going to make it." Nina didn't respond. She was still looking at the old man, his face softening with each breath. She held her breath, waiting for the moment to pass, for it to fade. But it didn't. It stayed. The quiet presence that had surrounded them, the unspoken understanding that they were all connected in this strange, mysterious dance of life and death. And for the briefest moment, Nina wasn't just a nurse. She was part of something bigger, something that wasn't about saving lives alone, but about knowing that every breath, every moment was sacred. The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, and the flashing lights outside the vehicle seemed to pulse with urgency, echoing Nina's rapid heartbeat. The quiet presence that had filled the back of the ambulance lingered, but the sense of urgency took over once again. Ben was already jumping out of the back, his hands steady as he started pushing the stretcher toward the doors. Nina followed closely, her heart still heavy with the weight of the man's words. "I saw you before we met." The old man's eyes, so filled with a depth she couldn't quite understand, kept coming back to her. What had he meant? Was it just delirium from the lack of oxygen? Or was it something more? Her mind raced with questions as they pushed through the hospital doors. The sterile smell of antiseptic was a jarring contrast to the damp, rain-soaked air they'd just left. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the sound of footsteps echoed off the linoleum floors. They rushed the man to a trauma room, and the doctors quickly took over. But Nina didn't feel the usual sense of relief that came when a team of medical professionals was finally able to take over. Instead, she felt detached, watching from the corner as the old man's life hung in the balance. Her partner's voice broke through her thoughts. "You okay?" Nina blinked and turned toward Ben. His eyes were filled with concern, but there was no time for a conversation now. She forced a tight smile. "Yeah, just tired." Ben didn't seem convinced but didn't press further. Instead, he turned back to the doctors, who were already working on the man. Nina stepped back, her eyes never leaving the old man's frail body. The machines beeped and hummed, but it felt like everything had slowed down. She couldn't shake the feeling that something profound, had just happened in the back of that ambulance, something she couldn't put into words. She had seen death before. She had felt the pulse of life slipping away from countless patients. But this felt different. She stepped out into the hallway, her thoughts swirling, and made her way to the break room. It was empty, as it usually was at this hour. She grabbed a cup of coffee, the warmth of it doing little to comfort the cold emptiness inside her. She sat down, staring at the coffee cup in her hands, trying to make sense of everything. She had always prided herself on being logical, on understanding the mechanics of saving lives, of bringing people back from the edge. But now, with the old man's words echoing in her mind, she didn't feel so certain. Was it possible that what he had said was true? Had she seen him in some other time, in some other place? The idea seemed ridiculous, yet the certainty in his eyes had shaken her to her core. She didn't believe in miracles, not like that. But what if she was wrong? "Nina." She looked up, startled, as Dr. Harmon stepped into the room. He was one of the more senior doctors, and though he usually kept to himself today, his expression was softer than usual. "How's the old man?" Nina asked, unable to keep the concern out of her voice. Dr. Harmon sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's stable for now. We've got him on a ventilator, but he's still critical. We'll know more in a few hours." Nina nodded, relieved, but her heart still felt heavy. Something was unsettled within her, something she couldn't explain. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice low. Dr. Harmon raised an eyebrow. "Sure." "Do you believe in something more?" she asked, the words almost foreign as they left her mouth. He tilted his head, surprised by her question. "Like God?" Nina paused, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I guess so." Dr. Harmon hesitated, then shrugged. "I believe in the power of medicine, in science, but I also think there are things we can't explain." Nina sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. The words, the presence, the man's eyes, it was all too much. But one thing was clear, she couldn't ignore what had happened, not after everything she had felt in that ambulance. "Thanks, Dr. Harmon," she said, standing up. She didn't want to go into more detail. She wasn't even sure what she was asking for. He nodded, and she left the break room, walking back down the hallway toward the trauma room. When she returned, she found that the old man's family had arrived. They were gathered in the waiting area, eyes filled with hope and dread. Nina stood quietly by the door, observing them, trying to ignore the pull in her chest. She'd seen families like this before, people holding on to hope in the face of the unknown. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, the weight of it all pressed down on her. The old man's daughter caught her eye from across the room. She looked at Nina, her face a mix of gratitude and fear. And for a split second, Nina felt something shift. That connection, that unspoken understanding. "I'm sure he's going to be okay," the woman said, her voice trembling. "He's a fighter." Nina nodded, offering a reassuring smile, but deep down, she knew that it wasn't just about fighting. It was about more than just breathing, more than just medicine. It was something beyond what she could comprehend, and though she didn't have the answers, she knew that, in some way, she wasn't just a nurse anymore. She had been a part of something bigger, something she didn't yet fully understand. Nina stood at the window of the trauma room, watching the soft flicker of the lights in the hallway, her thoughts tangled in a mess of questions. The sterile white walls of the hospital felt colder than they should have, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken words. She couldn't shake the image of the old man's face, the way his eyes had looked at her with that strange, profound recognition. "I saw you before we met." The words echoed in her mind over and over again, like a melody she couldn't quite place. Her fingers were restless, tapping against the edge of the counter. The hospital was quiet tonight, unusually so for a busy emergency room. The stillness seemed to press in on her, intensifying her thoughts. She tried to focus on the mundane tasks, checking through charts, making sure everything was in order, but her mind kept drifting back to that moment in the ambulance. The old man had been on the brink, struggling to breathe, yet in that brief moment of clarity, he'd spoken with certainty. "I saw you." What did he mean? Was it a hallucination from oxygen deprivation? Or something more? Something deeper? The questions swirled like a storm, but Nina had no answers, no clear path forward. "Hey, Nina." She turned to find Ben standing at the doorway, his expression neutral, though there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. Nina gave him a small smile, trying to push the worry from her face. "Yeah, just thinking." Ben didn't look convinced. He stepped into the room, leaning against the counter beside her. "About the call?" Nina nodded. "I can't stop thinking about what he said, that he saw me before." Ben raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, before?" "I don't know. He said that he saw me in the dark when he thought he was alone, when he couldn't breathe. And then, when I got there, he said, 'I saw you before we met,' like it wasn't the first time he'd seen me." Ben was quiet for a moment, clearly processing her words. He crossed his arms, a small frown forming on his face. That's strange. But we've all heard strange things from people on the edge of life. You know how the brain works in those situations. Lack of oxygen, drugs, the trauma. It can mess with you. Nina nodded slowly, though a part of her didn't buy it. Maybe. Ben placed a hand on her shoulder. You're doing great. Don't let it get to you. I know, Nina replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it. But something felt different. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Nina didn't know how to explain it, how to make sense of what she had felt. The encounter had shaken her, but she couldn't shake the certainty in the old man's eyes. Whatever it was, whether it was the oxygen, the fear, or something else, it felt real. Ben's voice broke through her thoughts. He's still critical, right? Nina blinked, snapping back to the present. Yeah, they've got him on a ventilator. They'll know more in a few hours. Ben gave her a reassuring smile. He's tough. I've seen people come through worse. Nina nodded, though her mind was still far away. The hospital, the machines, the endless work, it all felt like a blur. But tonight, something felt different. The weight of it all pressed on her chest, suffocating her. She had always kept her distance from her patients, kept herself emotionally detached. It was easier that way. But tonight, she felt herself slipping. A part of her wanted to reach out to understand what the old man had seen, what he had meant. But another part of her was afraid. What if she was wrong? What if there was nothing there? What if she was just chasing a feeling that didn't exist? The hum of the fluorescent lights above her made the air feel even colder. She crossed her arms over her chest, rubbing her arms to ward off the chill. She didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending it didn't matter, how much longer she could push away the feeling that something had shifted. The door to the trauma room opened and Dr. Harmon stepped inside, looking at Nina with a tired but hopeful expression. He's stable for now, Dr. Harmon said, and Nina felt a brief flutter of relief. We're going to keep him on the ventilator for a bit longer, but the signs are positive. We'll have a better idea in the morning. Nina gave a soft nod, her shoulders sagging with the weight of the moment. Thank you. Dr. Harmon gave her a knowing look before stepping back. Out of the room. The silence returned, heavier now, settling over Nina like a blanket. She couldn't keep avoiding it. The encounter, the words. She couldn't push it aside any longer. The truth was, she didn't know what had happened in that ambulance. She didn't know why the old man had said what he had said, but she couldn't ignore it. Something in her, something deep inside, told her that there was more to it than just a medical emergency. There was something more, something real. But what? And why her? The questions lingered as she stepped back into the trauma room. The old man's family was still waiting, their faces a mix of hope and exhaustion. The daughter looked up as Nina entered, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. Is he going to be okay? The woman asked, her voice trembling. Nina met her gaze, her heart heavy, but she didn't know how to answer. We're doing everything we can, she said softly. We just have to wait. And wait they did. The hours stretched on, but the quiet presence remained with Nina, lingering like a shadow in the corners of her mind. The hours passed in a blur. The waiting room remained quiet, save for the occasional murmur of voices. The soft beeping of machines echoed through the hallways, a constant reminder of the work still left to be done. Nina sat at the nurse's station, staring at the monitor, her hands still. She had done everything she could. She had stayed calm, focused, and had done her job. But tonight, her mind refused to settle. The old man's words were lodged in her brain like a splinter she couldn't pull out. I saw you before we met. She had tried to rationalize it. It was the stress, the lack of oxygen, the way the body reacts in extreme circumstances. But the feeling, the weight of those words remained. She couldn't shake the sense that something bigger was at play here, something that went beyond science, beyond medicine, something personal. Her shift dragged on, and eventually she found herself standing at the door of the old man's room. She didn't know what she expected to find, but the need to check on him felt urgent, like a force she couldn't ignore. The beeping of the ventilator was the only sound in the room as Nina stepped inside. The man lay there, eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with the help of the machine. He looked fragile, vulnerable, like a man caught between two worlds. She stood by the bed for a moment, unsure of what to do or say. But then, something shifted. The man's eyes flickered open and his gaze locked onto hers. For a brief moment, the weight of everything fell away, and she was no longer just a nurse. She wasn't just trying to save a life. She was part of something bigger, something that she couldn't explain. The old man's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was clear. "You came back." Nina's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a challenge, like a recognition of something she had yet to understand. "You're awake," she said softly. He nodded, slowly, his breath shallow. "I saw you before in the darkness. I saw you when I was lost. I was afraid, but you came for me." Nina's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond. He was still weak, struggling to keep his eyes open, but there was something in his gaze, something that made her heart ache. "You're safe now," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "We're here." The old man gave her a faint smile. "You don't understand. You're not just here. You've always been here. I saw you, even before this life, before this world." Nina felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What was he saying? Was this just delirium? Or was he saying something more? "I don't—" She stopped herself. The words didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. But before she could continue, the old man's expression softened. "I've seen you, nurse. You've been by my side before, not just in this world, but in the one beyond." Nina recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had to be hearing things. This was too much. The science, the medicine, it didn't fit. But then, there it was again, that presence, that strange, unexplainable feeling that hung in the room like the air before a storm. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes closed again, and for a moment, he seemed to drift away. Nina stood there waiting, her mind racing. What was he saying? Was he seeing something she couldn't? When he opened his eyes once more, he looked at her with a quiet intensity. "You've been there in the dark when the air is thin. You've walked beside me when I couldn't breathe. You've always been there." Nina's head spun. She was a nurse. She understood the science of it all. But this felt different. She couldn't explain it. She didn't know what to say. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. "I've only just met you. This is the first time." The old man smiled faintly, his eyes soft. "No, you've always been there. I've seen you. Not with my eyes, but with my heart. You've been my guide when I couldn't see. You've always been there." Nina's chest tightened. The tears she had been holding back threatened to spill over, but she didn't know what to do with them. She didn't know what to do with any of this. She had always believed in the certainty of the work, the logic, the medicine, the protocols. But now, standing there in this dimly lit room, with the weight of the old man's words pressing down on her, she felt something else. "I'm just trying to help you breathe," she said softly, the words feeling too small for the moment. "I'm just trying to do my job." The old man's hand moved slowly, reaching for hers. His grip was weak, but there was something there, something deep. "You've done more than that. You've brought me back. You've been there when I needed you the most." Nina blinked away the tears that threatened to fall, but she couldn't stop the shaking in her hands. She didn't know what was happening, what he was saying, but she couldn't deny the way his words settled deep inside her. "You've always been there," he repeated, his voice fading as his eyes closed once more. Nina stood there, her heart pounding, her mind reeling with confusion and disbelief. There was no explanation for what had just happened, No medical term, no procedure, no logic that could explain the weight of those words. All she knew was that, for the briefest of moments, she wasn't just a nurse. She wasn't just trying to save a life, she was part of something far greater, something she couldn't fully understand, but knew, deep down, was real. The days that followed the old man's recovery were long, heavy with unanswered questions. Nina tried to focus on her work, tried to keep her thoughts grounded in the tasks at hand, but she couldn't escape the pull of what had happened. Every call, every patient, every moment in the ER seemed to blur together, the noise and chaos of the hospital, a stark contrast to the silence that lingered in her mind. She could still hear the old man's voice, his words reverberating in her thoughts. "I've seen you before. You've always been there." She didn't know what it meant, but it haunted her. It wasn't like any other call she had ever had. It wasn't just a patient fighting for their life. It felt like something much bigger, something beyond what she could see or understand. Ben had noticed the shift in her, the way she moved through the hospital like she was in a daze, her eyes distant. He'd asked her about it, but she had brushed him off, unable to explain the emotions that were swirling inside her. She didn't know how to explain it. She didn't even know how to understand it herself. That night after her shift, Nina drove home in a daze, the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She needed answers. She needed to understand what had happened. Why had the old man said what he did? What did it all mean? Her apartment was quiet when she arrived, too quiet. She dropped her bag on the couch and collapsed into a chair, running her hands over her face. She closed her eyes, willing the thoughts to stop, willing the questions to fade. But they didn't. They never did. She found herself reaching for her phone, scrolling mindlessly through her contacts, until she saw the name that had been lingering in the back of her mind. Dr. Harmon. He was the one person in the hospital who had given her a moment of clarity when everything had seemed so uncertain. Maybe he would have some insight. With a deep breath, she dialed his number. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Dr. Harmon," she said, trying to sound calm. "It's Nina. I need to ask you something." There was a pause on the other end. "Sure, Nina. What's going on?" Nina hesitated, unsure of how to ask. "I've been thinking about something. A patient I had. He said something to me, and I can't shake it. It's been bugging me for days." "What did he say?" "He said that he saw me before we met, that I had always been there, that I had been beside him when he was lost." There was another long pause. Nina could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end of the line before Dr. Harmon spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I see. And what do you think it means?" "I don't know," Nina admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it feels real, like something bigger, something I can't explain." Dr. Harmon's tone softened. "Nina, I know you're a nurse, you're grounded in the science, in the facts, and I get that. But sometimes there are things we don't understand. Things that can't be explained by medicine or logic. Sometimes people see things, or feel things, and maybe it's not our job to explain them, maybe it's our job to just listen." Nina let his words settle over her, the weight of them sinking in. He wasn't giving her answers, but maybe that was what she needed. Not answers, but a willingness to sit with the unknown, to allow herself to feel what she felt, without trying to force it into a box of explanation. "Thanks, Dr. Harmon," she said quietly. "I needed to hear that." "You're welcome. Just remember, Nina, not everything has to be figured out right away. Sometimes it takes time." She nodded even though he couldn't see her. "I'll keep that in mind." After hanging up, Nina sat in silence, her mind finally at peace. If only for a moment. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't even know if she would ever have them, but maybe that was okay. Maybe there were things beyond the science and the protocols, things that couldn't be explained, but only experienced. For the first time in days, Nina felt a sense of calm settle over her. She didn't have to understand it all. She just had to keep going, to keep doing her job, and to be present in whatever came her way. And maybe, just maybe, she would start to understand, piece by piece, what the old man had meant maybe in time the answers would come. But for now she would just keep breathing, keep helping and keep listening. Because sometimes that was enough. A week passed. The old man had made a remarkable recovery, far beyond what Nina had expected. His family had been told he was stable, and although he wasn't out of the woods yet, the prognosis was good. Still, Nina couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened, that the encounter, the words, meant more than just another patient's close call. It was during the quiet moments between calls that she found herself replaying that conversation over and over. "You've always been there." What did he see? Was it just a moment of delirium, or something else entirely? She had no answers, but the need to know, to understand, kept gnawing at her. One morning, as she was finishing up her shift, she got a call. The old man. He wanted to see her. At first, Nina hesitated. It wasn't unusual for patients to express gratitude, but there was something different about this. She hadn't expected him to seek her out. She thought about it for a moment, then, after a deep breath, she made her way to his room. The door opened with a soft creak. He was sitting up in bed, his frail body wrapped in hospital blankets. But his eyes, those eyes, were alert, filled with something Nina hadn't seen in a long time, a peaceful kind of knowing. He smiled when he saw her. "I knew you'd come." Nina's heart tightened in her chest, but she didn't say anything. She walked in slowly, her eyes meeting his. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Better," he replied, his voice stronger than it had been. "Much better. But that's not why I asked you to come." Nina's stomach knotted. She sat down in the chair beside his bed, unsure of what was coming next. The old man took a deep breath, his chest rising with a slow, measured movement. "You've been thinking about what I said, haven't you?" Nina didn't know how to answer. She nodded. "I can't stop thinking about it." He reached out his hand, weak but steady. "I don't want you to misunderstand me. What I said wasn't about me seeing you here in this room. It wasn't about seeing you as a nurse." Nina's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of his words, but she didn't know what he meant. He continued, his voice softer now. "It was about seeing you in a place that's not here. It's hard to explain. But when I was struggling to breathe, when I thought I was alone, I saw you. You weren't just the nurse in the ambulance. You were something more. You were a guide, a light." Nina felt a chill run down her spine. A guide? A light? She had never thought of herself like that. She had always been just the person who did the work, who fixed the problems, who kept people alive. She was a nurse, nothing more. But this old man, someone who had been at death's door, was telling her that she was more, that she had been something more than just a medical professional to him. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a kind, almost knowing smile. "You don't have to understand. Sometimes the things that matter most don't make sense. But you were there. When I couldn't breathe, when I thought I had nothing left, I saw you. You were the one thing that gave me peace." Nina sat in silence, the gravity of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She didn't know what to make of it. She didn't know if she could accept what he was saying, but in the quiet of the room the words hung in the air, undeniable and real. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor in the corner. It was like the world outside had faded away, leaving them in this small, intimate space where the old man's words felt like a sacred truth. Finally, Nina spoke. "I don't know what to say, but I'm glad you're okay." The old man's smile softened. "I'll be all right, thanks. To you. And I'll never forget what you did for me." Nina felt a lump form in her throat. She wasn't sure what she was feeling, but it wasn't just the relief that came with knowing he was going to make it. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. A sense of connection, of something beyond the surface of her daily work. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for sharing that with me." "You'll understand one day," he said, his voice calm. "One day, you'll understand why you were there, why you came when I needed you most." Nina didn't have the words to respond. She only nodded, feeling the weight of his gaze on her. It was as if the world had shifted, just slightly, and now everything felt different. She wasn't sure how or why, but she knew she would carry the old man's words with her, even if she didn't fully understand them. As she turned to leave the room, the old man called out softly, "You've always been there, you know, even when you didn't realize it." Nina stopped at the door, her hand resting on the handle. She didn't turn around. "I'll remember that." And with that, she stepped out of the room, the door clicking softly behind her. The hallway was quiet, but Nina's mind was anything but. The weight of the old man's words lingered in her thoughts, a reminder that there were things in this world, things in life, that couldn't be explained, but only felt. The days after the old man's recovery were a blur. The routine of Nina's work, the constant stream of emergency calls, patients, and long hours, pushed the strange encounter further into the background of her mind. But the words lingered, never fully fading. "You've always been there." Every time she glanced at a patient, every time she pushed through another difficult call, the memory resurfaced. She had always been the one to fix things, to be the calm in the storm. But now, there was a sense of uncertainty that had crept into her life. On one particularly quiet evening, Nina found herself alone in the break room, sipping her coffee in solitude. The low hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound that filled the space. She had a few moments to herself before the next call. Her shift had been slow, unusually so for the emergency room. It gave her time to think, too much time. She tried to focus on the clinical side of things, as she always did. The charts, the medications, the patient updates. It was what she knew best. But her mind kept drifting. Back to the old man, his words, his gaze. She wasn't sure if it was a feeling of guilt or wonder or even fear, but something inside her had shifted. And then, as if by some unwritten law of the universe, her phone buzzed, pulling her out of the quiet of her thoughts. It was a text from Ben. "We've got another one, elderly male, respiratory distress. Same address as last time." Nina's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to brush it off, to tell herself it was just another call. But the address, the same address as before, made her pause. The old man's home. It could be anyone. It could be a coincidence. It probably was. But something inside her wouldn't let the thought go. She quickly replied, "On my way." The ride to the house was faster this time. The rain had cleared, leaving the night sky clear, the stars sharp against the inky blackness above. The ambulance swayed gently as they drove down the winding roads, the hum of the engine and the soft buzz of the lights filling the space. Ben glanced over at Nina. "You okay?" Nina nodded, trying to push the unease from her chest. "Yeah, just thinking." Ben raised an eyebrow. "You sure? This isn't like you. You're usually the first one ready to jump in." "I'm ready," she said quickly, a little too quickly. "Let's get this over with." They pulled up to the house, the same small, modest home, with the same porch light flickering in the distance. The front door was open, and Nina could see the figure of a woman standing in the doorway, a hand pressed against her forehead. Nina's heart sank. It was the old man's daughter. She could feel the weight of her gaze, even from a distance. The woman stepped forward as they approached. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear. He's been struggling to breathe again. I don't know what's happening. He won't wake up. He said..." Her voice caught in her throat. "He said he was waiting for you." Nina's chest tightened. The words didn't make sense. He said he was waiting for you. It was the same feeling, the same uncertainty that had gnawed at her from the moment she left that room. The same presence, the same unshakable sensation that something more was at play here. "Where is he?" Nina asked, her voice firm despite the chaos inside her. The woman pointed to the living room, her hands trembling. "In there, please, help him." Nina stepped into the house, her mind racing, her hands steady as she pushed past the threshold. She moved quickly, Ben close behind her. When she saw him lying there on the couch, the same frail old man from before, her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were closed, his chest barely rising with each breath. He was alive, but just barely. His oxygen mask had slipped off and his breathing was shallow, erratic. Nina's heart hammered in her chest as she rushed to his side, Ben already preparing the equipment. She worked swiftly, pulling the mask over his face, trying to steady his breathing. But the old man's eyes flickered open. It was the same look, the same knowing. "You came," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with certainty. "I knew you would come." Nina's hands shook as she adjusted the oxygen mask, trying to focus on the task. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. All she could do was work, breathe, do everything she could to keep him alive. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady now, despite the fear building in her chest. "Just breathe. We're going to help you." But the old man didn't respond in the way she expected. His eyes, still hazy but full of recognition, looked directly at her. "You've always been here," he said, his voice softer now, filled with a quiet peace. "I saw you in the dark, Nina. Even when I couldn't breathe, even when I thought I was alone, you were there." Nina froze. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her hands hovered over him, her mind spinning. She couldn't explain it. She didn't know what was happening, but she couldn't deny what she felt. The presence, the connection. "I'm just a nurse," Nina whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. "No," the old man replied, his voice filled with a knowing calm. "You've always been more." The words struck her deeply, deep inside her chest. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment she knew. She understood. There was something bigger than her here, something beyond medicine, beyond what she could see or touch. She was here, in this moment, for a reason. As she worked to stabilize him, she couldn't stop the tears from welling up in her eyes. She wasn't sure if it was exhaustion, or the weight of his words, or something else. But in that moment, she knew she wasn't just here to save lives. She was here to be present, to help, to guide. The old man's grip on her hand tightened, just slightly, and he whispered again, "You've always been here." And for the first time in her life, Nina truly understood what he meant. The room felt different now. The steady hum of the hospital machines, the faint beeping of the monitors, it all faded into the background as Nina continued to work. The old man's grip was still firm, despite his frailty, and as she adjusted the oxygen mask once more, the words he had spoken echoed in her mind. "You've always been here." She had spent so many years trying to distance herself from the emotional side of her job, focusing only on the medical aspect. But today, standing by his side, those walls she had carefully constructed crumbled. She couldn't deny it anymore. There was something more, something unspoken, something that went beyond the cold, clinical work of saving lives. His daughter stood at the door, watching with a mix of gratitude and anxiety. Nina could see the worry in her eyes, but there was also a faint glimmer of hope. She knew the old man wasn't out of the woods yet, but something had changed. She could feel it. The air in the room was thick with it. "You're doing everything you can," Ben said quietly, standing beside her. He had been working alongside her, never asking questions, just moving with purpose as always. But even he couldn't ignore the tension in the room, the shift that had happened since they first arrived. Nina nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The words the old man had spoken weren't just about him. They were about her, about what she had been carrying for so long, the fear, the loneliness, the doubt. For years, she had put on a mask. She had told herself that the job was all about saving lives, keeping the chaos at bay. But the truth was, she had never let anyone in. Not really. She had kept her heart locked away behind the walls of professionalism and detachment. But now, with the old man's words ringing in her ears, she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She had always been more. And it wasn't just about saving people, it was about being present for them, about offering something beyond medical expertise, offering comfort, compassion, understanding. She had been trying to heal others, but in doing so she had never let herself heal. The old man's breathing had steadied, the oxygen mask now doing its job. His eyes were closed, and he looked peaceful. She stood back for a moment, just watching him, feeling a quiet sense of relief wash over her. Ben cleared his throat, pulling her back to reality. "He's going to make it," he said, though his voice was quieter now, softer. It was more of a statement than a question. Nina nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think he is." They stood in silence for a few more moments, the weight of everything still hanging in the air, but this time Nina didn't feel burdened by it. She felt lighter, as though a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The old man's daughter stepped forward, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking as she spoke. I don't know how to thank you. You saved my father's life." Nina looked at her, her heart swelling with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. "I didn't save him alone," she said softly, glancing at Ben. "We did it together." The woman nodded, her tears falling freely now. "You're an angel. You must be." Nina blinked, surprised by the words. She wasn't sure how to respond. She had never seen herself that way. An angel? She had always thought of herself as just a nurse, a person who did her job. But something inside her stirred at the thought. Maybe there was truth in it. Maybe, just maybe, this was what she had been missing all along. "I'm just doing my job," she said, her voice steady. But there was a softness to it now, a vulnerability that she hadn't allowed herself to show before. The daughter reached out, grasping Nina's hand with both of hers. "You're more than that. You've been a lifeline to us, to my father. And I will never forget what you did for us." Nina felt a lump form in her throat. The words, so simple, yet so profound, touched her deeply. She wasn't just a nurse. She had never been just a nurse. She had always been more. As the family left the room, leaving her alone with the old man once again, Nina took a deep breath and looked at him. He was still unconscious, but there was peace on his face now, a calm that hadn't been there before. And in that moment, Nina knew that the encounter, the words, had meant something. They had meant everything. For so long, she had tried to push away the parts of herself that felt deeply, that cared beyond the surface of the job. But now, standing here, she understood. She had always been more. She had always been the guide, the light. She had just needed to see it. And maybe that was the lesson, that in the darkness, in the chaos of it all, there was something beyond the work, something human, something real. The old man had seen it, he had recognized it, and now, so had she. She didn't need to understand everything. She didn't need to have all the answers, but she was here, and that was enough. As she left the room, the soft hum of the hospital machines surrounded her once more, but this time the silence felt different. The weight of it was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. And Nina smiled, for the first time in a long while, at the quiet understanding that had settled deep in her heart.